is Daquan Blue, and you're listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Hello, everybody. This is Dan Forrest, and welcome to the October 2019 episode of The Archaeology of Connecticut. Today, we're going to be talking about 17th century archaeology, and particularly focusing on the first part of the 17th century. And we're really pleased today to be joined by two fantastic guests. First, I'd like to introduce joining us on the phone, Dr. Walt Woodward. He's our state historian and professor at the University of Connecticut. Walt, can you say hello to everybody?
Hi, Dan. Hi, everybody. How are we today?
We're very well, Walt. We're thrilled to have you.
It's great to be here. I wish I was down there with you.
Thank you. And also joining us in the studio is Dr. Sarah Sportman from the Public Archaeology Survey Team in Storrs, Connecticut. Sarah, can you say hello to everybody?
Hi.
All right. So for today's episode, when we're talking about the 17th century, there are just a couple of things we want you to keep in mind as we go through this conversation. One is that when, certainly for me, when I think about my education and my understanding of Connecticut history as a child, what I learned in school and even in college was very much focused on this period. To the extent that it was even discussed, was really a brief transition between the arrival of the English and the Dutch, and then a very rapid transition to discussions of the Revolution and the establishment of the early Republic. And in fact, a huge part of our history and the way we formed as a colony here in Connecticut and eventually as an early republic is a direct outcome of the 17th century, which has always gotten a lot of short shrift. The other piece of this to keep in mind is that archaeologists for decades have struggled to find archaeological sites associated with the 17th century. And it's not always easy to explain why. So if we think about this, we have a lot more information about where the early places of settlement were located in Connecticut. It should be theoretically easier to find evidence of that, but it's been exactly the opposite. And in fact, much of what we know about Connecticut's very early colonial experience has come from analogy from excavations that were conducted in eastern Massachusetts or Maine or other early colonial settlements here. So that's changed quite dramatically over the last 5 years, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about those more recent discoveries. So before we get into the archaeology, Walt, I know this is a particular period of interest for you, and you've published quite a bit on the 17th century history of Connecticut. Can you give our listeners a sense for those first years, in particular the very early English settlements in Connecticut?
Happy to. You know, Dan, you are so right about the limited exposure people have to this fascinating time period. I like to tell people that the way most people are taught Connecticut history is that Adrian Block arrives, Thomas Hooker comes to Hartford, they have the first Thanksgiving, everybody goes to sleep, and then they wake up to the American Revolution. when in fact, this first century of settlement, from the arrival of Adrian Block in 1614 and frankly slightly before that period, all the way up to the Revolution, is one of the most dynamic and complicated but terribly interesting periods in all of Connecticut and American history. You have the Connecticut River, this river that we think of as, you know, so beautiful and such a peaceful place today, was for much of this period a river of war. You had the first major Anglo-Indian War in New England in Connecticut, the Pequot War in 1637, a trans-New England a kind of a global, at least for the region, war in King Philip's War in 1675. And then right after that, you had a series of British imperial wars with France that involved French and Indians from the 1680s all the way up to just before the American Revolution. So while we look at our New England towns, church spires and the white greens, and we think of these people building their city on a hill, they usually were building a palisaded fortress on the hill because they lived in almost continuous fear, confusion, and really wondering what was going to happen next. There were many tribes competing with each other, indigenous groups. The idea that the English colonists were a homogeneous, collaborative group is completely overstated. The plantations in New England competed with each other. And of course, up until the 1670s, the Dutch were in the background. So there was turmoil and confusion everywhere. It's a fascinating time to study.
That is a great introduction, Walt. Thank you for that. I think, you know, a couple of things really stand out to me about this period as you learn more that really is glossed over or not even addressed in a lot of the histories, or at least the public histories that are readily available. I think one of those is the great importance of economy, the market, and trade for all of the parties we're talking about, whether it's the indigenous groups and their relations both with the colonists as well as with each other, and these sort of great sort of continental scale struggles in a lot of ways between the European powers and their jockeying for control of trade or even land here in the New World. Does that reflect the current historiography of this period as well?
It is absolutely true. In this world where people wondered who they could trust and they lived, you know, kind of with arched eyebrows staring at each other, they still recognized the value of trade. Everybody had something the other group wanted, whoever you were. At first, when the Europeans came, they needed food and they wanted furs. The indigenous groups really valued, especially metal edge tools, but also this whole range of European goods and technologies that were new to them, which they could. And you know all this. I mean, you know this as an archaeologist. They would adapt European trade goods for their own cultural uses, and they also would replace over time, some of their indigenous practices using European trade goods. So though there is a lot of friction interculturally and a lot of competition among groups, there's a real desire to keep those economic channels of communication open with each other. And I think those are the kinds of things that make the archaeological finds of the past few years in Connecticut fascinating to me.
It is. I completely agree with you, Walt. And I think the other aspect that you've mentioned as well that's really important as we're talking about the archaeology is that truly tenuous state of the early colonies and settlements and the uncertainties surrounding each of those settlements and the individuals who lived in them. So if you gloss over the history, you think of this, I think people often think of this as a struggle for land, when in fact it's much more complicated, and there are machinations by parties all across this sort of landscape on how to sort their way through this sort of unprecedented circumstance where all of these cultures are suddenly in collision and have to resort things in a way.
One incident that underscores this, and it's one that even people who don't know much about the 17th century have perhaps heard about, is the Pequot War of 1637. Mm-hmm. And of course, the highlight of that is something that is often called the Massacre at Mystic, when an English force of some 80 to 90 people attacked the fort, a Pequot fort village near Mystic, and in a morning killed several hundred, 300 to 500 native people, men, women, and children. And, it is seen as a sign, many people see it as a sign of this incredible technological dominance of the English and their kind of their crushing ability to overcome the natives. And that's not true in several different ways. One of the one of the reasons the English went to that fort, it was in response to an attack on Wethersfield the week before, but Thomas Hooker, who preached to the soldiers when they went off to fight in this massacre up at Hartford, there's a sentence he said to them in his sermon that it identifies how seriously weak the English were at this moment. He says, "The Pequot shall be bread for us." And we hear that, I think, as a metaphor now. But in fact, historians looking at the records now realize the English, just before that attack, were almost starved and needed, it was the end of winter. They had had 2 bad harvests. They had just moved to the region. Their crops had nearly failed. They were literally running out of food, and then they had this attack in Wethersfield. When they went to attack the Mystic Fort, the great treasure that they hoped to capture as a result of taking this fort was food. And the fact that they got in the fort and found that the Indian resistance was so strong, they felt that to save their lives, they had to set fire to the village and get out of there. It's a sign that they failed in their quest to actually take the fort, get food, and get through the winter. So this was a time when cultures were facing off, and there was no purely dominant culture at the beginning. It was a deeply contested time of great, of great struggle, simply for survival for all sides.
Yeah. And Walt, the other thing I think about the Battle of Mystic that really stands out that many people are not aware of is that the majority of the forces attacking the Pequot Fort were actually other Native Americans, right? There were allies of the English and rivals of the Pequot, and those people who participated, the indigenous people who participated, in many respects were so horrified by what occurred. The echoes of that really are traceable in the next several decades until King Philip's War. And
one of the Narragansett leaders, they were allied with the English, with the troops fighting in the village, went to John Mason, who was the English commander, and said, "Mock it," which means too much, too much. That the carnage from the indigenous perspective, they'd never seen anything like this, and they just didn't understand it. Yeah. When Native people fought, they fought to take captives, especially while they were dealing with European diseases. They wanted to take captives who they could incorporate into their tribe over time. Europeans who had been fighting religious wars with each other, when they went to fight, they fought wars of annihilation to create so much damage that no one would dare fight them again. So it's 2 different cultural perspectives, and the result was awful.
It is, and I think our colleague Kevin McBride, who has been on previous episodes of the show, has been very emphatic on this point that the Pequot War was the first war of extinction, and it really sets the tone and is a model in many respects for the Indian Wars that go all the way through the 19th century that are more prominent in many people's imaginations and understanding of American history, particularly in the West. So
it's absolutely true. One of the things that all English settlers coming to New England carried with them, and it was seared into their consciousness, was the stories they had heard, the memories of a 1622 Powhatan Indian attack along the James River in Virginia, in which, after years of conflict with the English down in the Chesapeake, a combined pan-Indian alliance along the Chesapeake had in one morning wiped out 25% of the English population in a battle of retribution. So the Europeans, when they got here, feared more than anything that all the Indian tribes would get together and fight them at once. And part of this vicious English assault on the Pequot War is, it is done with that. It's done out of fear, and it's done out of a memory of how powerful Native groups could be when they allied.
Yeah. So, for that really fantastic introduction, and thank you again for that, Walt, I want to pick a couple of threads as the lead into the discussion about the archaeology. One is the uncertainty that everybody on the landscape was facing, and the extremely complicated relations among all of the English, right? There's a lot of strife among the colonies themselves. There's a lot of jockeying for dominance. Not just among the European powers, but between individual colonies within Connecticut and other New England states, and as well as this incredibly complexly intertwined lives that indigenous and non-indigenous people were living, and how dependent in many respects they were. So with that as an introduction, Sarah, I'm going to ask you to describe a little bit of your recent research at the Webdean Stevens House and property in Wethersfield, Connecticut.
Sure, thanks. We've been conducting work at the Webdean Stevens House since 2016. The archaeology there was being done for a new education center, which they're currently building. And we did a survey in the backyard of the property. And going into this project, we had a good sense that being located in Wethersfield, right in downtown Old Wethersfield, the Webdean Stevens Museum certainly had the potential for 17th century occupations. We had no idea what we might find. We were really expecting to find more 18th century kind of Revolutionary War period things. But in our survey, we did a test pit survey of the backyard where the education center is going to be built. And in one test pit, right at the corner of the project area, we came down on these very deep stratified deposits of 18th century materials that seemed to be overlying potentially earlier things. And at the bottom of this test pit, at almost a meter deep, we found an assemblage of plain red earthenwares. There was an 8/64 pipe stem, kaolin pipe stem, some lead shot, some animal bones. And when we got back and got everything cleaned off, it turned out we also had a diagnostic 17th century button, which was really cool. And the deposits were really well stratified, meaning that the old stuff was on the bottom and it got younger as you went up, which is what you want to see. So when we went back to do additional work, one of the areas we focused on was this area. And we couldn't have been luckier. We kind of hit the jackpot. In our phase 2 excavations, we opened up about 3 meters in this area and came down on an incredibly rich archaeological deposit. We had 17th century farthing coins, all kinds of ceramics. We had, we found wampum beads. We found more kaolin pipes. We found Portuguese tin glazed ceramics, and a few other things that were very clearly 17th century. But the really important thing were these features that we found, this long linear soil stain and associated posts that we immediately recognized as some kind of wall. And that was really how it started. And we went on and expanded the excavations from there and discovered that we had a really significant component of an early 17th century site. And from the artifacts, it appears to date to right around the time of the Pequot War, maybe into the 1640s.
That's great. And so for non-archaeologists, one of the great challenges for identifying and really isolating these 17th century sites is that a lot of the materials that you find can occur in later sites, and they're often associated with 18th century occupations in Connecticut. So a lot of times what archaeologists are really trying to do is what Sarah's describing, is find where those later materials are completely absent. And it's often as much by the absence of the more common materials that you start developing a concept that you might have an earlier deposit. And Sarah, you mentioned the diameter of a pipe bore.
Yes.
So for non-archaeologists, can you explain why those tobacco pipes are so important for historical archaeologists?
Yeah, they're datable artifacts, particularly in the early period, because the pipe bore sizes, the hole that the smoke was drawn through, changes in a way that people have figured out over time. You can do a statistical formula and date them to particular periods. So we think of them in terms of basically drill bit sizes, like 8/64 of an inch, 9/64 of an inch. And those two large sizes are from the earliest periods, the earliest 17th century periods. And as you go through time, they get smaller and smaller as the pipe stems got longer and manufacturing became more regular. The formula to date pipe stems is really, based on statistics and large sample sizes. But at the same time, when you have those pipe stems, those early with the big sizes, that's a pretty good indicator usually, even if you just have one or two, that you're in something early. And it really should be considered at least a hint of a diagnostic artifact.
Yeah. And then the ceramics you mentioned, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about the 17th century for the European goods that are coming into the colonies and that are being used by both the colonists and indigenous peoples is that those materials are made from in many cases, all across Europe. And you'd see a lot less of that variation actually over time. By the 18th century, these are industrial goods that are being manufactured in huge industrial operations and brought over by the shipload. And so to a certain extent, a lot of people have access to relatively similar materials. And in the 17th century, what we're starting to learn as these sites are being investigated is that there's a lot more variation. You see materials coming in from northern Italy, from Tuscany, from the Rhineland, from England, and then all of these amazing sort of Dutch tin glazed wares as well. It's really quite remarkable. Some of those continued to be made and used into the 18th century as well.
Yeah, and at Webdean Stevens.
I was just going to say it really challenges our concept of a globalizing world today when you see how much international trade was going on in the 16th and 17th centuries.
It is great. And I think the other theme that you can pick up on, too, is that everybody is jockeying to control trade. And the English become much more successful in the 18th century than they were in the 17th century in many respects. So, Sarah, I know one of your main areas of focus for your research is really looking at the animal remains and the food remains from sites. And I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of these sites in terms of changing our entire perspective for how the early colonists were living. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in Webdean Stevens?
Yeah, definitely. So we only looked at a sample of the faunal remains or the animal bones from Webdean Stevens to date, and also some of the botanicals as well. We took a 4 meter square basically and did faunal analysis and botanical analysis from that area of the densest part of the site. And my colleague Katie Reinhardt did the botanicals, and we've actually done some papers on this. But Webdean Stevens has a really interesting assemblage. First of all, the preservation is incredible. And that's really been a surprise with these sites, that the preservation of all types of material. I mean, these are the earliest, colonial sites that we have. For the longest time, nobody could find them. And all of a sudden, we're finding them, and the material that we're getting out of them is phenomenal. So the bone preservation is excellent. At Webdean Stevens, we had everything, from big cow bones all the way down to tiny little eggshell fragments, hundreds of them, which are incredibly rare on sites. You don't often get that kind of preservation. And this was an accident there. We had an 18th century ash layer above that really helped to preserve a lot of the material in the 17th century deposits. So we lucked out with that. But at Webdean Stevens, we had a range of domesticated animals in the assemblage, but also small game, birds, and fish. Lots and lots and lots of fish, which makes sense on the Connecticut River. It's an easily accessible local resource. And we went into this with certain expectations in this period, expecting to see a lot of pig in the faunal assemblages, because pigs, sheep and cattle are a little bit fragile as animals go. And when you're kind of, blazing trails and colonizing places where you've never been before, there's a lot of threats to these type of animals. And the harvests were bad, the weather was bad, there were more predators, wolves, and things like that in the area. So people were really working to try and build up their herds over time. But pigs were a little bit different. pigs in the 17th century were quite a bit different than the pigs you think of today. They were larger, they had giant tusks. People would just let them go out and forage for themselves in the fields and the forests, which oftentimes got them into trouble with their neighbors, and also native people, because they would get into crops and things like that. It was oftentimes a very important aspect of the tensions between different groups with the pigs. But so pork was an important part of the diet, and that's definitely reflected in the Webdene-Stevens assemblage of all the domesticated animals. We also have cow and sheep, but in much smaller numbers than pig. And small game birds were really important in the diet, which is interesting because this is sort of a very English kind of yeoman farmer dietary thing. So we had passenger pigeon and turkey, perching birds, small kind of songbirds. We had, I think, duck, and quail. So a range of birds, and chicken, of course, and a bunch of eggs. Just a tiny little bit of deer, which was actually a really big surprise, because you would think in this earliest time period that people would be making more use of wild game. But it really, fish and pig and bird were the key aspects of the faunal assemblage, which was interesting.
So for Webdene-Stevens, we have something that we can think of as kind of a European, as you said, yeoman farmer kind of signature for what we think they're eating. And it does appear that they're actually consuming a lot of the animals that they're raising in the immediate area, and clearly taking advantage of the Connecticut River. I think one of the curious things, so the Connecticut River was actually much closer to the Webdene-Stevens site at the time. So for people who are only familiar with the modern landscape, what is today Wethersfield Cove was the Connecticut River channel, right? So that changed in the 18th century during a storm. So the river itself was actually even closer than it is today, and clearly was a major asset, not just for trade, but as a source of food. And so, Sarah, do you have evidence of cod at Webdene-Stevens?
No, we did not find cod at Webdene-Stevens. Most of the fish were smaller. Yeah, so I think probably local, just from the river, from streams, that kind of thing. A lot of them weren't really as well preserved as some of the other bone, and was hard to identify. At some point, we're going to get a bigger assemblage and really spend some time on the fish. It's really not my area of expertise. It's something I'm trying to learn. The fish are very hard.
Could I ask a historian's question about the food supplies?
Of course.
It is surprising to me that in Wethersfield, where you would have expected there to be a bountiful supply of deer, you're not finding them in the food remains, or you're finding very few?
Yeah, I mean, from the sample that I did from Webdene-Stevens, we just had a handful of deer bones, which was a huge surprise.
I wonder, from what I know of that area throughout the 17th century, especially around Wethersfield, it truly was a conflicted period long after the Pequot War, and there were ongoing tensions and conflict with the Wangunk Indians for decades. I wonder if that absence of deer might reflect a kind of reluctance on the part of the English to actually go into the woods and go hunting in places where, this wasn't their natural territory. This was the indigenous people's areas. Is that a kind of fanciful speculation?
I don't think so, not necessarily. And I also think that probably in the earlier periods, maybe in periods where relationships weren't as tense, that English people were probably trading with Native Americans for venison, because they weren't all necessarily prepared to be game hunters and things like that coming from England, if you think
well,
about it.
Well, there you go, true. Yeah, they had to learn how to hunt. They had to learn how to hunt for deer before they actually were good at it.
Yeah.
And Walt, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought too, because I think it makes for a particularly interesting contrast as we get into the discussion of the Hollister site. So for now, we're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with you. Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Walt, so you just had an interesting suggestion about the lack of venison in particular, but also really there are clearly some wild foods that are being consumed by the people at the Webdean Stevens property. It makes a very interesting contrast to the next site we're going to talk about, which looks radically different in many, many respects. And I think your observation about, in particular about the timing for the tensions with the Wangunk and even the Pequot is likely relevant to that, the discussion and the contrast between these two sites. So before we move on to the Lieutenant John Hollister site in Glastonbury, I'm going to ask Sarah just to circle back for a moment. So although the research is really has a ways to go for the recent excavations at the Webdean Stevens, if you were to estimate the time range for that 17th century component that you're looking at right now, what's your sense for what it dates to?
Sure. The artifacts and the documents actually seem to line up really well, which is nice. In the 1630s, probably around 36 or 37, a man named Clement Chaplin moved to Wethersfield, and he actually owned that parcel at the time. That's where his home lot was. And he actually lived in Wethersfield from about 1637 to 1646. He packed up and moved back to England. He was a really important person in the community, but he was also a very difficult man. He didn't get along with anybody. He was constantly fighting with people. He fought with the minister all the time. And he basically just, went back to England. And I think he actually became a minister when he went back to England. So we actually have a really good, clear stop date for these deposits. And so far, the archaeology has held up pretty well in terms of really not finding anything post 1650 in these deposits.
So that is really remarkable because we have almost no other sites in the state with any extensive assemblages or investigations that date to really this first period, this initial period of English permanent settlement here in Connecticut. So we're gonna move from that, and we're gonna move across the Connecticut River to South Glastonbury, and we're gonna move forward about 15 to 20 years, which doesn't sound like very much time, but is actually a pretty different context, both in terms of just a few years later for how all the relationships among the people living on the landscape have changed, but also the location of this next site on a frontier and how that sort of frontier location is reflected in the way people were living. So the Lieutenant John Hollister site, this is actually an area where the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, FOSA, and the state archaeologist Brian Jones had been working since 2015. It's a really remarkable story. So one of the Hollister family descendants who owns the property was really interested and invited FOSA to come and investigate what had been essentially the local story that the Hollister site was located in this horse pasture. And in cooperation with the Glastonbury Historical Society, a whole series of investigations started. And what I love about this story is rather than just charging out there with shovels and trowels and popping holes in the ground to try to figure out where things were, Brian took a very intentional approach to this. So the whole survey started with remote sensing. So essentially ground penetrating radar and magnetometers, two different instruments that can measure characteristics of the soil below the ground and give you a sense for what's buried below without actually peeling anything off or digging down into it. Those surveys were conducted and found what appeared to be clear rectangular holes, anomalies in the ground that very likely were cellars of some sort. And so the subsequent years of excavation have really refined that and followed up with some additional geophysical survey. And that excavation has been conducted by a wonderful various groups of people, coordinated by the state archaeologist. So Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, FOSA, has provided hundreds of hours of volunteer work. Scott Brady, who is not with us, and I'm going to poke him hard next month, and he gets to talk a lot more. Scott has been out there for many, many weeks, in particular working on this, but also veterans groups from the north end of Hartford, as part of a program for enrichment and getting more diversity in archaeology and providing much more diverse experiences for students in many communities in Connecticut. this has really been a sort of textbook way of approaching archaeology in a different way, in a much more sort of inclusive way for this. So the investigations, like Webb Stevens, have resulted in a really remarkable assemblage, this primarily dating from 1650 into the very early 18th century. So a few years following what we were just talking about with Webb Stevens. The other part about this is, as I mentioned, this site, when it was occupied, was much more a frontier area. This was not a settled community with a town green or a town commons with a whole series of farmsteads. These were a small number of individuals related, farmers, really tenant farmers primarily, it appears, who were living in a fortified farmstead. And they were fortified for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the tensions with the local Native American groups. So, Sarah, I know you've also done analysis for the materials at the Lieutenant John Hollister site. Can you describe a little bit of the contrast you see in the foods that people were consuming between these two locations?
Yeah, actually, it's an incredible contrast. The Hollister site, so I guess just to provide some context, the faunal remains that I looked at from the Hollister site were from some of the earlier excavations that Brian did out there. It was a series of 3 cellars that they had found with the ground-penetrating radar, and the bones that I'm going to talk about came from one of these 3 cellars. So Brian was kind of thinking in terms of these cellars as possibly connected and possibly being part of a larger structure, but the timelines for everything hadn't been completely ironed out. This cellar, the south cellar, was not stone-lined. It was the only one of the 3 that was not stone-lined, and it had a mean pipe stem date, of about 1650. And the fact that it wasn't stone-lined, the pipe stem date, and a few other things kind of suggest that it might trend towards the earlier side of this site, which is really interesting. It also had a fantastic faunal assemblage, and it is so different than Webb Stevens. The closest comparison would be, I think, late woodland Native American village sites. The faunal assemblage is really much more like that. It is so heavily dominated by deer. We have domesticated animals. There's cow, pig, horse, and sheep or goat. But in much smaller numbers, deer dominates by far. But there are also just this wide range of wild animals represented there. There's black bear, raccoon, woodchuck, muskrat, skunk, squirrel, chicken, turkey, a bunch of birds, passenger pigeon, perching bird, just like at Webb Stevens, 3 or 4 different kinds of turtles. We had salmon or trout, probably trout, sturgeon, and then cod, this site, which is different, and then some unidentified fish. But the deer really stand out as just incredibly dominant in this assemblage, and it's really interesting for this time period.
It is, and I think this is one of the points where archaeology really sort of demonstrates that it can contribute a very different information than what we see from the written records. So through all intensive historical research, a lot of the probate records for the individuals who lived on this property have been identified. And the tenant farmers, my first impression when reading their probate records is they were quite prosperous for a landless family, in essence, and had quite a bit of livestock. So when that contrast is even more interesting. So here you have a family who very likely is raising livestock for market, but what they're actually consuming looks much more like an indigenous pattern where there is a huge amount of wild food, both plant and animal, that is being consumed on the property.
Yeah, and there are wild plants in both of these assemblages. I mean, corn, was quickly integrated into the English diet because they needed it for survival, and it quickly became integrated in New England foodways. We all think of it as part of New England cuisine today, as well as beans. But lots of nuts. People were gathering a lot of nuts, hickory nuts, hazelnuts, and that's, again, very similar to earlier Native American time periods where you see that as an important component of the diet.
Yeah, in fact, this description, as you said, sounds very much like a late woodland assemblage, a late woodland indigenous site, with the exception of those few domesticates that are showing up. So, Walt, going back to your point, I think one of the other interesting aspects about the Hollister site is there is a lot of evidence for interaction with the local Native Americans there. So there's one very large, exceptionally large Native American storage vessel, that was clearly used by the residents of the house for storing food, which was found with a lot of other European wares. That was disposed of in one of these cellar holes. That material, the date that we know from previous excavations, also lines up. It's between roughly 1637, really comes into the fore right around the Pequot War, and ends right around King Philip's War. So, again, the material culture, like Webdean Stevens, is really locked in a way that we rarely see. Normally, we see jumbled assemblages where decades or centuries of life are in a mixed context, and it's very hard to tease things out. So both of these sites are very unusual for that, and they happen to align with one of the biggest gaps in our knowledge about the history of Connecticut. So they're remarkable for that. So
well, and that's what makes right now such an amazing time for early historians and archaeologists of this period. It's as if after 400 years, the past has finally decided to let us in. It's great.
It does feel remarkable. 20 years ago, we were all comparing 17th century archaeology to the Paleo-Indian period, in that the models that we had in mind from, those excavations I had mentioned earlier, particularly from around Plymouth, the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, the signature seemed to be extremely sparse material culture, like a few handfuls of material after extensive excavation. So the expectation is that there would be very little material found at these. And so for that reason, it was often compared to these really rare, very early indigenous sites. And they were also points of obsession for a lot of archaeologists who spent their careers trying to track these sites down and investigate them, and often were very frustrated where they ended up. So it is like a dam breaking, and it is remarkable. And I'm so proud that Connecticut, in particular, is able to contribute to this extent, not just to our understanding of our own state's history, but also to the history of the New England region in particular, because this data is going to be, I think, mind-blowing for a lot of our colleagues from the surrounding northeastern states.
I don't think there's any question about that. The buzz that, if buzz is the right word for it, the kind of the excitement and the anticipation that the combination of the Webdean Stevens site, the Hollister site, the battlefields of the Pequot War project that Kevin McBride has been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. It's just, it's palpable that the feeling that we are really going to unpack this dynamic and crucial period for New England history in new ways. It's just, I can't wait to see what you guys pull out of the ground. So get back out in the field, would you please? Well,
and Walt, I'm really glad that you raised Kevin's work on the Pequot War sites, and as well as now King Philip's battlefield sites as well. So for our listeners, Kevin McBride and the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center has, through a series of grants from the National Park Service, done really remarkable research on sites associated in particular with the Pequot War. And they started in southeastern Connecticut, and more recently have been working in Saybrook for the original fortifications, English fortifications, of what became the Saybrook colony. That research, like the work we've talked about at the Hollister site and Webdean Stevens, the fruit is, rather than just being luck, archaeologists stumbled into something, which, if we're being honest, sometimes happens, and we're thrilled when it does. This work is really the result of really meticulous research, documentary research, a lot of field research using a lot of modern technology, whether it's remote sensing, geophysical survey techniques, as a way to finally put our fingers on some of these materials and understand that. And the Pequot War battlefield surveys in particular have been pioneering in their use of metal detecting, which for many of our listeners you're probably screaming, like, metal detecting is not a new technology. It has not been used as effectively in archaeological research, and we're really, for many of us, just suddenly realizing how effective it is at identifying, in particular, these early sites. So there's two pieces of that. One is that you can effectively cover a much larger area than you can digging test pits with this, but also the percentage of those metal objects that are diagnostic, that we can tell with great confidence when they were made and when they were likely discarded, is much higher than it is for almost all other materials that we find. So even ceramics, which are commonly found and are important, we rarely have as focused a date range as we can get from the metal objects themselves. So we're learning to interrogate that historical record about the Pequot War, in particular because those stories have been distorted in many respects, and they're very, like many of the early colonial records, they're told from a very particular perspective, and the material record in many cases corroborates, in some cases, the places where these events occurred. But the detailed analysis suggests that the way these skirmishes or battles unfolded is a little bit different from the way the English wrote things down. So that research is fantastic. I would encourage the listeners, Connecticut Explored, a wonderful magazine here, largely focused on the Connecticut River Valley, appropriate here at the ICRV studio. Kevin McBride and Brian Jones had an article in the summer issue, in particular about the contested landscape of the 17th century, and it is a very good companion to this discussion today. So I would encourage everybody to read that if you have access.
Yeah, and I would just like to build off of that. I think that another interesting aspect of this battlefield project is that tracing some of these, battle movements and troop movements and retreats and things like that, they've actually come across Pequot domestic sites, which is a really interesting thing. And Megan Wilson, who couldn't be here with us tonight, is doing her dissertation on that. She's a graduate student at the University of Connecticut. And this is shedding a whole new light on Pequot and other native lifeways in the contact period as well. Sites that we also thought, up until recently, we would never find. We'd never be able to find.
And because we like to weave different threads back and forth between our episodes, I'll remind the listeners, for those of you who were able to catch last month's episode when we were speaking with Marissa Turnbull and James Quinn, one of the points in particular that James Quinn was making is that actually one of the things he is most interested in is this post-colonial, post-contact history for Mohegan and what archaeology is able to say about that. And in particular, the point being that Native history didn't end when the colonists arrived. It didn't end when the quote-unquote Indian Wars ended, that it's continuous. And I think this is something that, as archaeologists, we're becoming much more effective at, recognizing you can't tell these stories as separate narratives. They're so interwoven that you can't understand the colonial experience without understanding the relationship with the local indigenous groups. And you can't tell the indigenous story as just a simple narrative of a less dominant group being pushed aside and displaced by Europeans. It's ultimately much more interesting. In some respects, it's more tragic. But it's a much more human story and much more compelling story when you understand those relationships amongst all of these parties. So, okay, everybody. So, Walt, I'm going to come back to you for just a second here. When you're listening to this, you're starting to see this data, and I know you've been paying attention to a lot of this stuff as it's been coming out of the ground and have been talking to a lot of the researchers. As an historian, when you're thinking about these material records that are starting to come out, is there anything in particular that really stands out in your mind as being a surprise or an entire dimension about the 17th century that you wouldn't necessarily have been thinking of from the histories themselves?
It is becoming increasingly clear. This interdependence of peoples in this period it's becoming so much more clear that there weren't two cultures, English and Indian, or English and Native. There were many, many different cultures interacting and intertwined and completely independent. And the arc of history, what I see happening is the settlers came and history moved up the river with them. So there was an advancing frontier throughout the 17th century that didn't go west necessarily, or it did go west to some extent, but it also went north. And people are people are not only, the frontier is not only traveling northward, but people are adapting and changing together from Saybrook all the way up the river. And this is a story that the archaeological community is unpacking right now in brand new, fascinating ways. And, we historians will come along with you. We'll examine what you're finding, put it in the context of the historical documents and the historiography. And I think we're going to rewrite the history of early New England in dramatically different and dramatically interesting new ways.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Walt. And where we're going to wrap things up today, because normally archaeologists are talking about all the things we don't know. One of the things is we don't yet know about this. We know these particular details, but we don't yet know about some of these big ticket items. I'm going to return to just a little bit of that theme now. So we've talked a lot about the early English settlements. Where we started the discussion today, the English are not the only colonial powers. They're not the only Europeans on the landscape, even here in Connecticut. And I think one of the parts of this 17th century, particularly very early 17th century history, that is yet to be fully explored by archaeologists is the Dutch trading posts in particular, and the role the Dutch played, the enormously influential role the Dutch played in intertribal relations and the relationships between the tribes and the early English settlements. So Dutch trade, particularly in coastal areas of Connecticut, was a major engine of Pequot power. Pequot had developed into one of, if not the most powerful and in some respects aggressive of the Native American groups, and certainly in southern New England, and vied in particular with the Narragansett, but other Native American groups. And a lot of that was in response to control of the trade with the Europeans. And the Dutch were the primary trading partners very early on. And there's a lot of jockeying that goes on between the English, the Dutch, the Pequot, the Narragansett, and quite a few other parties looking a little bit further east. So archaeologists, we don't have parallel sites yet for those early Dutch trading posts, but it's something that we're all working towards.
The historiography clearly shows that the English in Connecticut and the Dutch in what is now New York were at odds with each other for the first 50 years of settlement. And in fact, Connecticut, on 4 separate occasions, unilaterally wanted to declare war against the Dutch. They just couldn't get enough allies to go with them. And this is a sign of just how much we've forgotten about the history of this early period. It's one more element in a very complex mix.
Well, as always, we've run out of time long before we've run out of things to talk about on this episode. I really want to thank you, Walt, and you, Sarah, for joining us today. It's been a great discussion, and for all you budding archaeologists who are listening to us, find those Dutch forts. Thank you very much, everybody.